On Press Perspective today, we touch upon closures of schools here in South Korea and of airspace in the Middle East. Do stay with us. Hello and welcome. You're watching Press Perspective for this Friday, March 6th here in Seoul. I'm Min Sun-hee. We start our panel discussion today here on the local front with a tangible reminder about our grim demographic prospects. For more on this, I have Ruy Valdes with Spanish news agency EFE Spain here in the studio. Ruy, welcome back.
Thanks for the invitation.
I also have writer Colin Marshall with us. Colin, it's lovely to have you here.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Ruy, this week South Korea ushered in the start of a new academic year, and findings show the total number of first graders nationwide hit a fresh low. Let's start with these findings and their broader implications.
Yes, well, the finding is that there was fewer than 300,000 children that will enroll to first grade this year. The classes started this week. As a father of two kids, well, one of them also is a first grader. And just by talking with her mom, which is Korean, and comparing the size of the classroom, the number of classmates is drastically reduced. Just to compare, a few years back, the number was around 400,000. So this is a drastic drop that doesn't seem to be very optimistic that it's going to change quickly in the future. This is the first time it falls below 300,000 in history since the record started. And the decline reflects, of course, the sharp fall in births over the past 2 decades. Later, we will talk how there has been some improvement in birth rates, but still the country is far away to really dare to say that it's going to change and it's going to pick up to the numbers that they're supposed to. Just to have some perspective on the effects of this reduction, South Korean universities in total are more or less built to take in like 450 to 500,000 students per year. What I mean is that they are built expecting that around 500,000 will enter as first graders. If we now have 300,000, there's very high concerns that universities maybe will even have to shut down completely, many of them. What is sure is that there's a lot of reduction also in the numbers of teachers hiring. So this is a very serious issue in South Korea. We couldn't say it's a surprising issue because the numbers have been pointing out this direction for many years already. And well, as I mentioned later, we will talk more in detail about the numbers, but this is, well, just another example of another effect of low birth rates in different sectors. It could be labor, now it's education, and of course the country needs to figure out what to do in this regard.
Right, indeed. Colin, against the backdrop of this concerning reality is the growing phenomenon of first grade enrollment imbalances within elementary schools, especially here in Seoul. For the sake of our foreign viewers who may not be aware of this phenomenon, could you tell us a bit about it, and also how do you care to explain it?
Yes, this phenomenon may sound unfamiliar to many viewers in other parts of the world, but it might exist in certain forms where they live as well. I know it does in the US to an extent. But the South Korean school system, since about the 1970s, has been organized in theory to militate against the hierarchization, shall we say, of schools. So you don't want one on a higher tier than another within the public school system, one more demanded or preferable to another, which is not quite how it's happened in practice. And this idea of this sort of the polarization, you could say, of schools, or the polarization of demand in schools. In Seoul, it looks a bit like this. The city is divided into 25 gu, or wards, you could say. And even within each gu, there has been shown in the numbers of the entrance of elementary school this year, quite a large disparity between one school and another, even, as I say, in the same gu, or even just next to each other, the two proximate schools. One can have about up to 1,000 student difference, I think, in admissions. So you wonder what's going on there. And in the case of Seoul in particular, or Korea in general, but Seoul in an especially pronounced way, it has to do with real estate. And what that means is schools are preferred when they're near more expensive forms of real estate, to simplify it greatly, but a lot of it comes down to that. So near a bunch of old sort of 70s, 80s, 90s, which is still old by Korean standards, multifamily housing blocks, or old bila, they're called, sort of lower apartment buildings that are mostly rental. Those schools are not going to be as demanded. They're the ones that have accepted fewer students this year, because fewer have applied to enter, because fewer families have lived in those addresses. And then if you have a new apartment complex, an apa트 danji, built 5 years ago, say, that's expensive, you're going to get schools that are highly demanded in that zone, in that catchment area. And it's a bit like, as I say, it happens in the US. It's not that different. Where I'm from, housing prices are driven not entirely, but I think primarily in many cases, by school districts. A school district is seen to be a good school district if the housing near it is expensive. In other words, if the family income is high. So you get a bit of a feedback loop where families with a lot of money move into one area, and the schools become seen as better, which draws more money to that neighborhood, thus making the house prices higher and driving up essentially the barrier to entry of those schools. Here, a lot of it happens in the same way, but in a sort of Seoul urban development style, where it's a large, fairly dense apartment complexes. You build new ones, which attracts people. It attracts people to them, but also it sort of drives up the school demand. And then with the schools in demand, such as, say, in the area of Gangnam, broadly speaking, where we are, then the feedback loop keeps going. So, okay, these are where the good schools are. We got to move there. That costs a lot, and then sort of the demand to live there, again, it just makes the whole thing, it inflates the whole bubble. And so this idea that's been written about lately is that yes, we can have one school in one ward, another school by it, and there's this huge difference in how demanded that school is because of the forms of housing around it. So the proposed solution, one of them has been to begin at the urban planning level. This is not a problem you fix afterward, but one where maybe, and this is an inference of mine, maybe they mean providing incentives to build new apartment complexes, fancier apartment complexes, near where there are not already schools in high demand. Maybe it will work, maybe not if implemented, but urban development in Seoul, and more than anything, residential urban development, is a huge business here. And I think that ship is difficult to steer, to change the direction of very easily.
Right, indeed. Ruy, meanwhile, on an optimistic note, South Korea's birth rate, it rebounded last year, and this rebound has, of course, been covered by the foreign media. Could you tell us a bit about this?
Yes, well, before getting a little bit bleak, let's start with the positives. Yes, South Korea recorded 500,000 births in 2025. This means a 6.8% increase year on year. This is the second consecutive annual increase after nearly a decade of decline. It is also the largest annual absolute number in births in about 15 years. So yes, these are positive numbers. This means that there's something happening in Korea that is reversing the rate, but still, well, before going to the implications, let's start first with the causes, or this is official, the statistics office of Korea providing these numbers and the identified causes. They point out post-pandemic marriages, saying that many people of this effect was also seen in the previous year. Many people postponed their marriage because of the pandemic, and now we're seeing this effect of this relationship finally, well, they get married and then have children in a faster rate than before also. They also say there's a demographic effect known as the echo boomer generation. The people born in the early 90s is now reaching a peak of childbearing age. And there's also an increase of women in their early 30s, which is the age group with the highest fertility rate. Being that said, well, some articles or some press point out what government policies have been implemented, but before going into them, the government itself had mentioned when they presented these are preliminary results, that they could not conclude these policies were actually the cause of this reversal. It could be other factors like the ones I just mentioned that are more related to demographic, natural processes, etc. But well, still, they did say that when the final results come in, they could maybe identify more clearly which policies helped. Just To give a general perspective of what the South Korean government has been doing for years, hundreds of billions of dollars invested for increasing the birth rate with cash incentives and childcare subsidies for newborns, housing support for newlyweds and young families, expanded parental leave, in cases of allowing 3 years of shared leave, and programs aimed to encouraging marriage, even dating events made by the government. Now, considering all this, when we go to the cold numbers, still, as I was mentioning in the first question, Korea is very far from the substitution rate. So right now, their fertility rates went up to 0.8, which means this is more or less the number of kids expected that a woman is expected to have in her lifetime, and the replacement level is 2.1. This also, if we want to put in comparison with other countries, Korea is still at the bottom when you compare it worldwide in the OECD level. If you don't take into account places like Taiwan, Korea is still in the bottom. This is concerning because also, if you sum up that deaths are higher than births, we're still seeing that this will continue. The population decline will continue. Other factor that has been called a national emergency a few years back is that 1/5 of the population of Korea is already over 65. This is considered a super-aged society. So if you take on all those elements, even though we had this result, which is, we would say, positive, slightly positive, and what I guess the country is expected or wants to happen, the number in a cold analysis will still be far. And also, in the same press conference where they presented the results, they did point out that this doesn't mean that this is going to be a trend that will stay. So they still don't have enough data or enough information to conclude that we can start the party, as we would say in Mexico, but we have to be very cautious that this could be just a temporary result. Of course, let's hope not.
All right, fingers crossed for that.
Yeah.
Moving forward, Colin, this coming Saturday, the world celebrates International Women's Day. And in light of this occasion, there has been renewed attention on the wage gap between male and female workers here in South Korea. That being said, how well aware is the Korean society of this disparity? And do you believe there are enough efforts being made to better address it?
Well, the disparity has come up in the news domestically as well, and it's coming up right now, indeed, because there has been some research about this recently, or the research being talked about, the report being talked about, focuses on what we were just talking about, the birth rate, and what this disparity has to do with the birth rate, and how changing this could change the birth rate. Now, one thing that happens, I think it's been happening over and over the decades with OECD numbers, is that as soon as Korea joined the OECD, some metric would come out, one or another periodically, that ranked Korea at the bottom among the countries. And it got to be that the idea was the OECD, does the OECD exist just to shame Korea for doing badly on one metric or another? Now, of course, these days, Korea is not ranking at the bottom of all these lists, hardly at all. But with a metric like the income gap between the sexes, one thing that's a bit regrettable about the reactions here is that people look at the number and the Korea's rank, more to the point, and say we've got to change that because we're on the wrong end of the scale, which is not necessarily the wrong way to think, absolutely, but it also elides the question of why is this? Or why is Korea ranking here? Why did this number come out this way? And in the case of income disparity between men and women, there can be undesirable reasons for that, there can be neutral reasons, or it can be an effect of other conditions in the society not necessarily bad in and of themselves. So there are parts to untangle, but that's not necessarily the priority. The priority is to get higher up the ranking. And so with this report that I've referenced, which ties it into the birth rate, the researchers found, or have suggested, have argued, that compared to the other, if you look at the other high-income countries, in the OECD or elsewhere, what has happened there? Well, as the income gap has If the income gap narrows, you also get a higher birth rate. There's a correlation there. That's what they find. So the thinking is, whether the logic is bulletproof or not, I'm not sure, that if the gap can be closed here in Korea, then the birth rate will rise or should rise. Okay, maybe so. I mean, they say things like, one suggestion was, if men can leave work on time, which is sort of rare, if they can adhere to what's now called the kaltwegen culture, to not work overtime, leave as if a knife was cutting off the end of the workday, then that lets women, that lets men and women balance out the share of childcare at home or the share of housework, that sort of thing. So the idea is the men can take on a little more of those tasks, and the women can maybe spend a little more time earning. Those can balance out, and with that comes the rise in the birth rate. Again, I'm not sure about the intermediate steps, although I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea in and of itself. As with most discussions about the gender pay disparity, we could do well to look closer into the causes and understand more completely what's happening before sort of rushing to pull levers and address the problem.
Right, before rushing towards solutions then. Ruy, also on the labour front, the Financial Times, it claims that South Korea is proving to be, and I quote, an attractive destination for migrant workers. What has been shared about the reasons?
Yes, well, basically the point is, yes, South Korea is increasingly becoming an attractive destination for these workers, especially in blue-collar sectors or agriculture and manufacturing. But, well, the article mentions how South Korea has reformed since 2004 and has eliminated recruitment brokers and high intermediary fees, how they have expanded visa quotas, how are they providing health insurance and pension coverage for these foreign workers, and that has motivated them to come to the country and even stay for longer times. The article also interviews a couple of them, which explains or support these parts, or why are they finding South Korea more attractive in terms of how much money they could make back in their home countries, the fact that they could send remittances to their families, and more or less in a positive light. The migrant workers, mainly of the ones that articles is speaking, are the ones filling what you would call 3D jobs. This means dirty, difficult, and dangerous. What the article points out is that young South Koreans are not willing now to do this type of labor, and this is, they even interview some business owners, and they say, the business owners, like, I don't even call South Korean young workers anymore because they would just not do it. Like, they wouldn't even take the interview or negotiate. So straightforward, they go and try to get this foreign labor. This, again, is a positive thing also related to the birth rate, in the sense that, as I just mentioned, as the same government is informing, we are still far from a substituting rate to re-increase the population. This means that South Korea needs to find other ways to increase it. We know, or at least the examples of some of the workers, of course, they're temporary. They go back to their home countries. Some of them maybe start families here with South Koreans, or they have their own kids, but still there's many challenges to, let's say, keep them here. Still, taking this into consideration, we could maybe see it as a big step into this next step in integration. What I mean with this is that in the current state of things, these workers, yeah, they face still restriction in their visas. It would make it hard to extend time or even to bring the relatives here. But, and they also suffer other factors like discrimination or they find it very hard to be integrated into the society. Still with those things, the more they come, you could think that people would get normalized. I remember reading an article not so long ago about, I think it was in Jola province. They were saying that this is one of the ones that have higher concentration of these foreign workers, and how they were serving Koreans and they were quite familiar, normalize the relations with them. They had a very different perspective in a positive way compared to regions that they were still not that familiar, or where migrant workers are kind of in isolated areas where they don't really interact with the society. still, the challenges, as I mentioned, would be to ease these visa expansions, or maybe even find ways to make it easy for them to become permanent residents. And also, the big challenge that this is more like a personal, this was not in the article, but this is a personal note. So if South Korea find ways to keep, it could be agricultural, manufacturing workers, or skilled workers. The article does mention that the government should expand and also start bringing people from other workers from more like skill areas. What you need, or what we need to accept if they're staying here, is that their second or third generation is going to be the regular now young kids. They're going to stay in the country. So it's a big challenge for South Korea to start accepting that maybe this is the one, if not all, it's a big part of the future or the new generation. And by integrating and by, facilitating the integration of these people that come to the country, also you can solve other issues like the low birth rate.
Right, indeed. The low birth rate leads to a shrinking workforce, of course, as well. Ruy, we will also have to touch upon something that is happening across the world right now that is of much concern to the international community. I'm talking about the events unfolding in the Middle East. What is the latest with regard to efforts by countries around the world to ensure the safety of their nationals in the Middle East amid the fresh outburst of violence there?
Yes, all over the world, countries are responding in Europe, America, and basically what they're what they're saying to the nationals is don't go specifically to Iran. But now we all know that the conflict has expanded. There's attack in all the region to many different countries, one way or the other. So basically, what we are seeing is efforts from these countries to take out the citizens that were there. As an example, Britain and France started at the middle of this week repatriation flights. New Zealand, Czech Republic, Slovakia. Reuters did a good piece in integrating all these places where they were repatriating. We're also seeing, and I think Colin will expand more in the local area, but many countries have to send military aircraft because there's not enough commercial flights, or even some airports are shut down. We were checking Korean Air or Japan Airlines, their flights to Dubai or Doha. They have been canceled until like the middle of the month at least. So basically this is what happened all around the world. If you go to the airline websites, you would see that there's like a narrow period of cancellation. But if we want to talk about uncertainties, let's talk about war. With war, you really don't know. U.S. President Donald Trump said when the war began that it will take more or less 4 weeks. We actually don't know. It's so war. With the problem with Ukraine and Russia, he also said he was going to solve it the first day he came into office. Or many people were also thinking that it was going to last much shorter. We don't know how much it's going to escalate. It's too fresh to know. And regarding the airlines or the flights going to these countries, and also when are the people who, let's say, South Koreans, Europeans that have worked there are going to be able to return in a safely manner? We have
really
no
don't
idea.
know. Staying with that then, Colin, what can you tell us very briefly about the efforts by the government here to ensure the safety of South Korean nationals in that region?
Well, they're in negotiations. Two Emirates flights have actually flown today from Dubai to Korea. So that has happened. That's begun happening. But the idea is to get commercial flights, especially by Korean Air, running maybe on the weekend. This has not been confirmed yet. But again, 2 flights have come this way. The idea is to get it going on some basis moving forward. But there are about 3,000 Koreans in the Middle East on a temporary basis. And the idea is to evacuate them if they desire to leave. About 20,000 living in the Middle East. So there could be a much larger number to move. And this is only the beginning. But flights have taken off for Korea. So there is a beginning that's been made.
Right, indeed. And we've also been told that the airspace between South Korea and Dubai has been opened once a day, starting today, that is. All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have today. Colin, as always, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you very much.
Ruy, thank you very much for your insights.
Thank you, Sun-hee.
Right, that ends this week's editions of Press Perspective. As always, thank you for watching. Have a good weekend.